Good morning. Morning. Welcome to the Charleston Library Society. Good morning. Thank you. Hello. Hi. Welcome to the Library Society. My name is Lisa Hayes. I'm the Director of Collections here, and I'm so delighted to welcome everyone here this morning for our book club. Today we are going to be hearing about The Demon of Unrest by Erik Larson, a book I'm sure many of you have read. I want to say thank you to our book club committee, especially for putting together these wonderful presentations that we get to do for book club. Today we're going to be hearing from Mike Gottlieb, one of our members of our book club committee, and Robert Rosen, historian here in Charleston, who's written several books about Charleston, and an attorney. It's really an honor to have him here with us this morning. So, thank you. I just want to make one quick announcement about the book that we've selected for our next book club, which will be January 15th of next year. This is called Playground, and it's by Richard Powers. It's a great book. Many of us on the committee have read it, so I hope you'll want to check this out January 15th.
Is it available in Buxton yet?
Yes, you can buy this in Buxton. This one is checked out, but you can buy it. Please silence your cell phones. And we're going to be doing questions with the mic, so wait till the mic is in your hand before you start asking a question. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Great to see everyone here. Welcome to another Charleston Library Society Book Club event. I'm your dynamic host, stated in the mail magazine, Mike Gottlieb, and it's my distinct privilege to help present today's book, Demon of Unrest by Erik Larson. If this is your first time here, or first time attending a book club event, I certainly hope you will come back. This is truly one of the special places in Charleston. We are so fortunate to have it, and all of the amazing events, lectures, authors, and musical performances that are hosted here. Today's book, Demon of Unrest, a saga of hubris, heartbreak, and heroism at the dawn of the Civil War by Erik Larson, is an account of the 5 months taking place between Abraham's election on November 6, 1860, and the bombardment of Fort Sumter in the early morning hours of April 12, 1861. And if anyone does not know, Fort Sumter is, I believe, that way, about 3 miles. Erik Larson is the author of several critically acclaimed books. Where many think his books are fictionalized history a la Mishner, they are not. Every instance or quote is factual. Larson has managed to make the historical accounts read like a novel. If any of you saw him at the Gilliard, he spoke about his technique to achieve this. He started his career as a journalist, and after seeing All the President's Men, became inspired to try his hand at writing a book. His first book, Lethal Passage, in 1995, was followed by Isaac Storm in 1999. However, his book, Devil in the White City, published in 2002, is what really catapulted him to the level of esteem he now holds. Then every 4 or 5 years, he has written another book, culminating in Demon, published this year. For me, what makes his book so enjoyable and compelling is his ability to weave 2 seemingly disparate stories into one. So I certainly encourage you to read his other books. In preparation for writing Demon, Larson visited Charleston. At his Gilliard appearance, he stated he never wanted to write a book about the Civil War. I guess he did not want to add to the estimated 60,000 plus books already written about it. So he wrote a book about the 5 months leading up to the war. He did his best to give his explanation how South Carolina became the place that started the war. At that time, our state capital, Columbia, had a population of 6,000 people, of whom half were enslaved or freedmen. Excuse me. Charleston had a population of only 48,000, of whom only 27,000 were white. In interviews, Larson has expressed bewilderment that such a small amount of people could be the cause of where a war started that ended up having over 600,000 dead Americans. And one question I want to ask all of us to think about when we open up discussion to everyone, and that will happen, is if you could pick one person during these winter and spring months of 1861, knowing all that you know now, whom would you pick and what would you have them do differently? Now, before we get to that discussion, it is my honor to introduce our guest historian, Mr. Robert N. Rosen. Mr. Rosen is a Charleston native, born some time ago, long after 1861, here in the BA at the University of Virginia, an MA from Harvard, and his law degree is from the University of South Carolina. Robert started his law career in 1873. In addition to his private practice, he has been an assistant city attorney during Mayor Riley's tenure and general counsel for the Charleston County School District. Somewhere along the way, Robert found the time to write several history books. His A Short History of Charleston, which was first published in 1982 and has been subsequently updated, is a must bedside book for your guest rooms. His other books are Confederate Charleston, an Illustrated History, The Jewish Confederates, and Saving the Jews, FDR and the Holocaust. One well-known Jewish Confederate who was raised in Charleston and is featured in Robert's book about the Confederates is Judah P. Benjamin. Benjamin became the Attorney General, Secretary of War, and Secretary of State in the Cabinet of the Confederacy. But that's a story for another day. Mr. Rosen is an accomplished historian, and we are fortunate to have him here today with us to discuss the Demon of Unrest. And before I go further, I need to thank my cohort, Tina Waltrip, over there, who helped me prepare for today and arrange for Mr. Rosen, and I could not have done all this without her, so thank her very much. Now I have prepared. You can clap. Good luck, Tina. She's not dynamic, but she's great. I have some prepared questions to ask Robert to get his take on the book and his insight into how he saw Charleston before the start of the Civil War. I am sure a lot of you have much to say regarding this book in those fateful months leading up to April 12th. We will be saving a lot of time for that, and I fully expect an engaged discussion. Remember, this book is about the events prior to the Civil War. We may choose a book on the Civil War in a subsequent book club event, but not today. I'm also hopeful that we may have a descendant or two of the people mentioned in this book. It would be wonderful to hear any tales passed down for keepsakes saved for 160 years. And I should have been doing this. This was from many years ago, 60 years ago, the Post-Courier did a publication, and that's what Fort Sumter looked like prior to April 12th. And this is what Fort Sumter looked shortly thereafter when the Confederates occupied it. And these are some of the people featured. Hopefully you recognize these three men. And also, Ms. Chestnut, who we'll talk about, Mr. Ruffin, of whom I had never heard, and of course Mr. Hammond, who was kind of an interesting character, to say the least. So, Robert, let's get started. Okay, Robert, what do you think Larson dwelled on that he did not have? And what, if anything, did he leave out, specifically the actions of William Seward?
Well, first of all, let me say this. I'm a huge fan of Erik Larson. It's just kind of coincidental, that I got asked to be on this program. But when I read Isaac Storm, I was like astounded by that book. And then Devil in the White City. I mean, I read the book and then I find out later that it's not a work of fiction. And that everything in it actually happens. I was like, this is incredible. And then the next book that I love all his books, but In the Garden of the Beasts is the one I'd recommend. I mean, it's about an ambassador to Germany at the time who's a historian. And his daughter, the plot is so unbelievable. The daughter's having this affair with a married man. And I'm going like, how can this be real? Apparently, this woman left a diary of all these salacious things, and like everything in it is true. So, so what he sets out to do here, is to write a story, but the story, everything is factual. So, I thought he did generally a good job. My only problem with it, to be honest, is I think he was in search of characters, of better characters, and he didn't find them. In other words, the characters in the other books are a lot more dramatic. I mean, Edmund Ruffin, if I'm wrong, y'all raise your hand and tell me, but I just found him to be kind of a buffoon. And, I'm sitting here reading about him going to Florida. I don't care. I don't care what happens to Edmund Ruffin. And whereas in the other books, you sort of care about the characters. And then I think he, and maybe I'm just nitpicking, but I think he left out James L. Pettigrew, who I think is a fascinating character, who would have fit into his chronology. For those of you who are not familiar with Mr. Pettigrew, he's the one who made the famous statement, South Carolina is too small for a republic and too big for a lunatic asylum. Which some people might say is true today. Anyway, Mary Chestnut says of Pettigrew, Mr. Pettigrew alone in South Carolina has not succeeded. He gets up from his knees when they say a prayer for our president, meaning Jefferson Davis. He might risk a prayer for Mr. Davis. Now, Pettigrew is a character, and he defied the Confederate government. There's a lot of material on him, so, if Erik would have called me when he was in Charleston, I could have helped him out.
But when we talked before, you specifically mentioned Lisa's disability.
Yeah, I think one of the things he missed. Well, I don't say he missed it because his history is not incorrect, but the drama of the first shot is much more dramatic, Lincoln and Seward, than he presents it. In other words, it's really, you could do a made-for-television movie about it. And his telling of it, let me say this, Lincoln sent two of his closest friends to Charleston, Hurlbut and Ward Lamont. And these were two men he trusted more than anybody. He came to Charleston. Hurlbut was a Charleston native. Lamont was his bodyguard on his trip to Washington. And they talked to everybody, and they got assaulted by various mobs. And so when they came back to Washington, Lincoln knew for a fact that if he sent a ship with supplies and he tried to supply Sumter, there would be a war. That was not a mystery at that point. He knew that. And Seward, meanwhile, over here, and you all know this, everybody knows this story, Seward ran against Lincoln, thought he ought to be president, but Seward was much more devious, I think, than portrayed in this book. He was furious that he didn't get the nomination. He does mention that Seward's still grappling with this, but the actual facts are, Seward put the order, remember the mix-up with the boat, how Powhatan got sent to Florida and sent it to Sumter. But that was a trick, that was a fraud perpetrated on Lincoln by Seward. Seward took the two orders, put them in a stack of paper. I mean, he didn't do that negligently. And the way Larson describes it is, Lincoln took the blame for it, but that was Lincoln being Lincoln. Lincoln knew very well what had happened, and so did Wells, the Secretary of the Navy. So Seward really thought that he could fool and put one over on Abraham Lincoln, who he thought was a not very smart Illinois lawyer. So he puts the orders in front of him. And then when Lincoln, when it all comes out in that midnight meeting with the Secretary of the Navy, Lincoln takes the blame on himself and he says, no, I want this ship to go to Sumter. And this is a ship that could have blown its way, it could have actually gone into Sumter. He tells Seward to send a telegram to New York. Well, I was looking at some books that I have on this, and one of the guys said, this is the slowest telegram in American history. This is at midnight. Lincoln tells him to send a telegram. The telegram doesn't get there like for 24 hours. Well, I mean, you could you could get on a horse and go to New York in 24 hours. And so, I think Seward is a much more evil, creepier kind of guy than he comes across.
Well, thank you. Just as an aside, if you ever get an opportunity to read Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Gottlieb, she really goes into that at great length. That's a wonderful book. You talked about the characters. What do you think of his, you want to add more about his research into these various characters, specifically Mary Chestnut, like in your thoughts?
Yeah, I have to tell you, I think people, when I was in college, there was a book called A Diary from Dixie, and looking out at this audience, I would think many people here, that's the first time you read Mary Chestnut. The story of this diary and of Mary Chestnut is very, very interesting. First of all, she is not a typical planter's housewife. Okay, Mary Chestnut would probably have been a top intellectual had she lived like in New York or in any town. She read voraciously. There's a biographical sketch of her. The latest book is Mary Chestnut's Civil War, which is about this big, and it's edited by C. Van Woodward. She ordered, when you look at the books she read, she really could have been a PhD or a professor. So we think of her as a sort of brilliant, romantic housewife who had insights into people, but she was a lot more than that. And so, even though she lived most of her life in Camden, she was self-taught. And she kept these diaries starting at the beginning of the war, and she kept them all through the war. Well, the version that you read is as edited in the 1880s. In other words, she kept these diaries, she reworked them, she did all kinds of things. But Van Woodward points out that even though they're rewritten, she keeps to the truth of what she said in the time that she said it. So, for example, Woodward says she's an abolitionist. I mean, think about that. This is a woman living on a plantation with 500 slaves. Everything they have, they owe to slavery. And she hates slavery. And that's not just for consumption after the war. That's how she felt during the war. And then here's that famous quote where she says, we live in a very sinful institution, and all the men go around acting like, all the women talk about the children who look like the other husbands, but they never think about their own husbands. I mean, Chestnut, her husband, as far as we know, didn't fool around with women, but his father was like a notorious woman. I mean, this was really a scandalous, way of life. And she knows that. She writes about it. So I think I think in a way, I guess some of that comes across in here because everybody quotes her. But I think Larson's looking more at the salacious and the entertainment part of it. In other words, the flirtation. Oh, that's fine. That's what people want to read. Gone with the Wind, 2.0. And he throws Hammond in there. I mean, this is a guy who had improper relations with his nieces, ages 13 to 15. So Hammond wasn't that physical. But that was just too good a story to pass on.
So you mentioned pedigree before. How about, was there anybody else that if you were to give a lecture about it, that you would have said, oh, this person also had a critical?
Well, I hadn't really thought of the firing of Fort Sumter as a novel, as a story. But I think somebody like Beauregard, Pierre Toutant, Gustave Beauregard, I love it. But some of the young men in Charleston sent Abraham Lincoln, I forget the exact poem, but it says, "We send old Abe our Beauregard." I mean, this guy was like, the women in Charleston loved him. There are all these stories. The women brought him flowers and gifts. He mentions that. But Beauregard is a very interesting character, so I would have spent more time with him.
Robert Anderson, gentleman there, such a critical role that he played in this. And yet, he was loyal to the Union, but he did have sympathy for the South. Do you have something?
Well, that's the thing about Anderson is, and he is everything that Larson makes of him. That's why, we used to call this conflict brother against brother. We now the whole narrative of the Civil War has shifted to other considerations. But when I was growing up, this was the war of, brothers against brothers. So you had all these stories of northern people who had southern relatives who fought for the Union and vice versa. But Anderson encapsulated, he was the first one. So he's from Kentucky, his family owned slaves, he sympathized with the South, but he had a duty to the Union. And I suspect he thought the Southern cause was not, he wasn't in favor of it. So he's conflicted. And that's what makes him such a great character, because he's in a position where he doesn't, it's kind of like Robert E. Lee. Lee really did not want to leave the Union Army. Lee did not want to leave the Union. Lee was not in favor of secession. Lee didn't even like slavery very much. So I guess what I'm trying to say is a lot of people were conflicted in this conflict. And I think Anderson is a great example of that. And that's why people admired him so much, because he did his duty, even though he had all kinds of reasons, not to.
You mentioned briefly, and it's the recurring theme in the book, the code duello. What was your take on, Larson's, use of basically every chapter, he had another thing? Because it originally was implemented for one-on-one duels, not necessarily a conflict of this.
I tried to get into the swing of things with the code duello, but they didn't seem to always match up to the chapter. I don't know. I think it was a little precious. In other words, he's trying. The code duello. The Southerners had an old-fashioned way of life that carried on into the 1860s. But remember, dueling in this code duello was part of English-speaking life. Alexander Hamilton, that was a duel, and so. But it did carry on in the South. The South, we have to admit, was behind the times in terms of somewhat.
Well, just taking it from a generic thing, do you think this code, this sense of honor, as Larson, maybe overblown it, like you used the term precious, or again, this helped sell books, or was it really something ingrained in these men?
Well, I don't think I think it's part of the Southern makeup of the Southern character, at least of the planter class. It wasn't in all people. And I do think Southerners were quick to anger and somewhat impulsive, well, at least those behaviors were rewarded in Southern society. But look, the South went to war because it had become apparent over 30 years that the abolitionist movement was not going away. And, it doesn't take a code duello for white people in the South to see that when John Brown decides he's going to attack people in Virginia, and northern churches and do-gooder organizations are praising John Brown, you have to be a fool to not realize that some kind of conflict is coming. I don't think the Southern reaction to John Brown and Kansas and the abolitionist movement was irrational at all, if you believe that they had a right to defend slavery. So I don't think it was so much the code duello as it was the reality of life. This was a racial issue. South Carolina, the coast of South Carolina, if you lived in Beaufort, you had 9-to-1, black to white. And, the white people were nervous. Thomas Jefferson said, we have the wolf by the ears, and we cannot hold on, and we cannot let him go. And, that was the dilemma for white Southerners.
One last thing before we open up discussion to this incredible crowd here. I know you're taking notes, and we had a chat. Is there something you would like to impart to us that maybe I didn't touch on and ask? Give you open-ended time to edify us.
No, I think you and I talked about it. I had all these thousands of comments. We reduced them to the time period allowed. So I'm going to respect that.
Well, then I'll let you answer first. Hopefully, I'm not stealing any thunder from somebody. I asked him, did you prepare? Because you had plenty of time. Who would you have been, again, knowing all that you know now, and go back to them and say, I would have done this differently?
Who would I have been?
Yeah, or you could be the, on their shoulder going, hey, don't do that, do this.
I would have been the captain of the first slave ship to come to Virginia, and I would have turned around and gone back.
Well, more to the period in question. I am going to steal maybe somebody's thunder. Again, we talked, and if any of you came, it was a little while ago, there was an author that came, I wish I could remember his name, I can't remember if it was Mr. Murray or not, who wrote a book about the 10 years working up to the Civil War. And he, for me, I should have heard him answer the question about Buchanan, President Buchanan, who, if I were him, long before Lincoln's election, I would make sure that all the Union forts, establishments, whatever you want to call them, in the South were extremely well taken care of, well fortified, well provisioned, and armed with men that were loyal to the Union. And I think that maybe that would have made a difference if somebody could have seen that, like, oh, they're ready and they're already in our backyard. Because
Delusional.
I'm delusional.
Delusional thinking.
Well,
Do you think Southern men?
I appreciate that from
You think Southern men who believed they were the kings of the world and who were very good fighters, by the way, and who would be intimidated by a bunch of Union lackeys and a couple of forts? I mean, they would have taken that in a week. No, I'm serious. I mean,
Seriously, I appreciate that because I definitely, we spoke here. You forgot more about this than I'll ever know. And by the way, we joked earlier, he has his pain. He recently had knee replacement surgery.
Yeah, I won't talk about this. Is not old age. This is knee replacement surgery.
And if anybody gets out of hand, he's going to go Preston Brooks.
That's right. Yeah, we talked about Preston Brooks.
And I think you already did on me. So, word to the wise, don't pick your kid. So anyway, thank you, Robert, for all that. That was wonderful. So we do open it up. There's a couple of people.
A couple microphones. So raise your hands.
Just raise your hand.
We'll come to you.
You people are going to talk a lot. So come on, get those hands up.
And in the front. And when you get the microphone, please speak into the top of the microphone. Thank you.
I'm just curious if you think things are more divided now versus then.
He wanted to know if you think things are more divided now than.
Oh my goodness! Are you serious? I mean, I think
You're delusional too, dude.
I don't get to do this as a lawyer. I have to abide by the code of civility in court. I'm not being a lawyer. I think that we're very polarized, and I think things are upsetting. But I do think people are more. I think this is a good thing about being a historian. The Civil War, 600,000 dead people, the entire South decimated. I mean, Charleston was feeling the effects of the Civil War when I was growing up. I mean, I grew up around Hampton Park in the 1950s. Downtown Charleston was, poor. And, that was still the fallout. It was only World War II that got Charleston back on its feet. And so, compared today to that, there's no comparison. I mean, Civil War is.
I concur. I mean, I'm married to a microphone, so I get to talk. Every now and then this comes up in discussion, and I think you forgot about the Civil War. I think you forgot about World War I and its effect, World War II and its impact. I mean, like I said, give me a break.
I think the study of history ought to make you feel more secure about the present. I mean, James Madison and the framers, they looked at the whole history of mankind. They looked at every government that ever existed. There was a democracy or a republic. They looked at every failure of every form of government, and they devised an incredible checks and balances and system which survived the Civil War. It was true the Civil War didn't prevent it, but it survived. So I think America is a fundamentally conservative, strong government. I mean, I had a friend this morning who told me, well, were you going to hide me when Trump, rounds me up? And I go, well, I know Richard Gargle is a federal judge on Broad Street. I think I can get him to issue a habeas corpus. How about that? I mean, we got 10 federal judges in South Carolina. They're not going to go along with these shenanigans. I mean, just like I said, the American government is a brilliant creation. It survived everything, and it'll survive this, whatever we're going through.
I appreciate anything anybody has to say, but let's talk about Larson and inspiring Larson.
Okay, well, now maybe I shouldn't say this, but I was just wondering, in his foreword, Erik Larson does say he was well on the way to researching this, the attack on Fort Sumter, when January 6th happened, and he said, I had the eerie sensation of watching the past and present merge. And so we don't need to talk about that, but I was just thinking about it as far as what you were saying, and wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Can I take that? Yeah, go ahead.
The reason I want to take that, you can answer from a historic perspective.
You're going too long. I got that.
I didn't think of this really until Robert talked about it, because I had read, several of Larson's books, and then he said, you gotta put something in a book so people will buy it. And again, when I started Larson at the Gilliard, the place was full. He writes books that we want to read, they're fun to read, but again, and this library, unfortunately, is full of books that nobody does read, because I cleaned a whole bunch of them, and I was looking to see when they were last checked out. And it was before I was born. Some of these books have not been checked out. So I think, I really enjoy Erik Larson, but he's going to say and write what he thinks somebody's going to buy.
Well, I'll answer this with the actual historical stuff rather than political. When you read the book, remember, Lincoln gets elected and the South is seceding. They didn't know if the election was going to be certified. I mean, it does, we had Pence. What was Pence going to do? Well, this is the same thing. Breckinridge had run for president, okay? And he was the vice president, and he was the president of the Senate. Guess who's going to preside over the certification of this election? The president of the Senate, Kamala Harris. It's the exact same thing. So Breckinridge, who had come in second to Lincoln, and who was a senator, had to preside over the proceeding to certify the election. Well, Winfield Scott thought, and some of the Lincoln people thought, that the Confederates were going to attack Washington and prevent the certification of the election. And there's a great book on it, which Larson cites in his footnotes about Lincoln's journey to Washington. Winfield Scott is one of the unsung heroes of American history. He had the army, he had cannons, he had Washington locked down in case somebody tried to interrupt the election process. So they thought something might happen. And there was kind of analysis to it. So, but once again, the system worked. Breckinridge stepped up, did what he was supposed to do, and Lincoln was certified, and that was the end of it.
Come on, people, I got lunch on this.
I think I'm on. One thing that I noticed was that in 1858, in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Lincoln said of the Southerners, they are just what we would be in this situation. It's less important that he said that than whether it was accurate. Aside from the morality aspects of slavery, did the South have an economic alternative to either seceding or creating a conflict that ended actually in war? The South was utterly dependent on the economics of their agrarian system that required slaves, whether or not that can be defended morally.
I have very strong opinions on all that. Everybody says the cause of the Civil War is slavery. That's partly true. The cause of the Civil War was racial adjustment. The white Southerners could not envision any society in which they were equal to black people. It's just racism, pure and simple. In other words, slavery, of course, I agree with you, is a very powerful, important economic consideration. But even if you could free the slaves, they wouldn't have been in favor of it because they didn't want to have a biracial society. I mean, it's deeper than slavery. And which explains why everybody, not everybody, but most white folks fought for the Confederacy. Everybody says, well, 90% of Southerners didn't own slaves. Well, that's true. But the white Southerners shared with the planters this racial animus, this problem. So I think the problem is just so deep, it was incurable. I mean, you could have abolished slavery. In other words, an alternative history would have been that some leaders were strong enough at some point in time to say, we have to have gradual abolition of slavery. There were all these plans to do all kinds of things. But, money trumps everything. So you can zone the city of Charleston to be livable and not have every hotel on every corner, but money trumps everything. And so slavery was just a very powerful economic incentive. I agree with you. Plus, they were also afraid for their lives. I mean, really. So I mean, it just people want to go back to history and fix it, but the time to fix it was in 1619.
To help you think of maybe something, right out here on the Battery, when that shelling took place, for lack of a better term, there was a party-like atmosphere. And if any of you have ever read about when the first Battle of Bull Run took place in Manassas, not from where I used to live, people came and set up picnics. I don't know what was going through their head to not expect a carnage of arms getting blown off and heads getting shot and things like that. So, still got a question, but you might want to think of what would you think of the fact that they thought it was a party? Yes, sir.
I do have a question, but I have a quick observation watching the pictures up there before. It struck me that Mr. Ruffin and Steve Bannon had the same barber.
What did you say?
They had the same what?
That Mr. Ruffin and Steve Bannon had the same barber.
Oh, Steve Bannon.
Anyway.
Hey, I'm jealous of both of them.
But that's not my question. That's not my question. My question was, we always have this picture of Lincoln. It's always august. You go to the movies, Spielberg and Henry Fonda, and Lincoln is, the Lincoln statue. And he's just a mythical figure. And then you read about, he comes into office, and there's this transition period. He's becoming president. And he looked like he was bumbling all over the place. This is never a narrative I've ever in any history, and I was a history major, so I read a lot of history. I've never seen a narrative where Lincoln looked like a bit of a bumbler.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I was upset with some of the stuff that Larson was saying, but I went back to the best biography of Lincoln by far is David Lincoln. And so I went back to look at how he explained it. And he says that Lincoln, had no executive experience, and that, he was overwhelmed, and that he was exhausted. And Erik Larson does say that. He said at one point Lincoln passed out or something, on the bed. And so there was a lot of bumbling. But I mean, he got into Washington. I know that story is somewhat comical because nothing bad happened, but I mean, he could have been assassinated in Baltimore. What would have happened then? And then when he got into Washington, the situation at Sumter was very fluid, and he had not had any experience with any of this. And he was looking to Seward and to other people for guidance, and Seward, meanwhile, stabbing him in the back. I mean, I do want to say this, I meant to say this earlier. Larson doesn't print it out as a statement, but it's in the text, the proposal to the president, where Seward on April 1, which the historians point out is April Fool's Day, he writes a memo to Lincoln. We have no policy, and nobody's in charge. And, I might suggest that somebody be put in charge so it would free the president up to do other things. And also, if you want to appoint somebody in charge, I don't mind doing it. I mean, this is I was kind of Googling this the other day. This is the most obnoxious, disrespectful communication to a president of the United States before or after. I mean, can you imagine Dean Rusk writing to JFK? Somebody's got to be in charge of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think I should do it. I mean, really? I mean, it's outrageous. It's outrageous. And so, I think it's hard to tell really what happened. One Southern historian believes that Lincoln set the whole thing up for a guy named Charles Ramsey. Most historians disagree with him, but it's a so much better story. What's that thing? If you got a choice between the myth and the facts, repeat the myth. But if you look at the message that Lincoln gave to Governor Pickens, he says, "I'm sending these ships with supplies, and if you don't interfere with it, I'm not going to attack the fort, or I might attack the fort if I give you notice of it at a later time." In other words, Lincoln, who was a master of the English language, and this is what Ramsden says. He says, this note to Pickens is a masterpiece of obfuscation, and you can't really understand it. You go back and read it, and it says, I'm not gonna really attack folks that are put soldiers in, but I might if I notify you later. Well, meanwhile the Confederates are sitting on pins and needles. Jeff Davis was a nervous guy anyway. He's pacing around in Montgomery, and nobody knows what's going to happen. And they can't let Lincoln reinforce the fort. But here he writes a note that basically says, "I'm going to reinforce the fort if I feel like it." And so Ramsdell said, to Southerners, it looked like a direct threat, whereas to Northerners, it looked like he was just trying to send bread to hungry men. And Lincoln said a lot of things later. He said, we sent the ships knowing that if the war started, it wouldn't be our fault. We were just sending food to hungry men. But that's not what the note says. And so Ramsdell saying Lincoln manipulated them into firing the first shot. But I don't think it's true, but I think it's a great story.
In regards to the readability of the book, I too am I'm an avid Larson fan. And I think what you said about the characters resonated with me. They were just sort of flat, and I couldn't get into them. And I kind of thought about the reason for that, and I thought, well, he really has no one to speak to who directly knew these people. He's pulling information from diaries and letters, and so to give him credit, at least he didn't try to fictionalize situations or personality characteristics he couldn't authenticate. But I did get a sense, I wanted to know with Anderson, a little more emotion and as to what was coming. And I also got a sense that people in Charleston, it was a party-like atmosphere. They had, I guess so naive, they had no idea how many Americans, would die in this war. And they didn't get a sense of how life-changing it would be. But I guess I got enough of the characters to know that with Ruffian, he was a warmonger. Hammond was amoral, molesting his nieces and power-hungry. And so, unfortunately, history repeats itself. But fortunately, maybe this country will continue to survive through it.
When we talked before, and what was just said, because I don't know if warmonger is the right term, like you talked about, the North was delusional how the South was going to proceed, and the South, you said, was delusional that the North would actually fight the war.
Right. Yeah, I think it's hard to go back in time and picture yourself being a white Southerner in 1860. I hate to say it because I know Gone with the Wind is not politically correct anymore, but a lot of it is pretty good history. Like when they're at 12 Oaks, you know. I know you've all seen it, so don't deny it. And all the men are, we'll kick the Yankees, we'll defeat the Yankees in 3 days, you know. And poor old Charles Hamilton, yes, we'll defeat the Yankees. And then Brett Butler, he said, well, Mr. Butler, you don't seem to agree with us. He says, well, he says, the North has got all the manufacturing plants, all the ships, all the guns, all this, all that. And all we got is a lot of bluster, you know. And I think that pretty much sums it up. I think the Southern leadership, I don't want to say they were delusional, because they really weren't delusional. They had beliefs based on what they had observed. What they observed was that, you know, the people in the North were not big on the military. I mean, in other words, there really hadn't been any wars. Well, they had the Mexican War, but the Southerners were more represented in the Mexican War, particularly in the officer class, than the North. And so there was a culture of military mentality in the South. And I think they got themselves worked up. Reading, it's kind of like in your own, you know, we talk about everybody in here is in their own bubble. You know, you're looking at Instagram to read you, but you're not looking at Instagram. And I think there were pamphlets, there were books. I think they really believed that their society was superior, that they could defeat the North in the battle. But more than that, I doubt one person in 100 thought there would ever be a war, because all of these controversies got worked out. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, Compromise of 1850. It didn't look like the North was going to fight. And the John Brown thing was worrisome, but that didn't go anywhere. So I think, you know, Chestnut himself, and you've seen this quote all over Civil War history, he said, I'll drink all the blood, you know, I will drink all the blood that's going to be shared in the world. I think he's not an unintelligent guy. I mean, he's an intelligent, worldly man. He didn't believe it. And I don't think most of the Charlestonians believed it. They just thought it was going to be, they were just going to secede. That was going to be the end of it. So it was a miscalculation.
Just fill a thimble, the amount of bloodshed, a woman's thimble.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing is they misunderstood the nature of Northern society. Look at it from the working people and the ordinary people of the North. They hated these Southern aristocrats. I mean, hated them. And they didn't care about it. It wasn't part of their daily life. But once they started blustering and threatening the Union, you know, these people, they coalesced around the idea of the Union. And of course, they totally underestimated Lincoln. I mean, they derided Lincoln. You can't believe the political cartoons. You know, Lincoln is an orangutan. And why should they be afraid of Lincoln? He was a country Illinois lawyer. He had been served one term in the House. I mean, who was he, really? So I think it was just two people, you know, totally misconstruing the other, really. And then, you know, after Fort Sumter, the people in the North just were fed up. So they exploded, and it was on, you know. So.
Someone over here.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated by the fact that Anderson had all of 78 men, 13 of whom were musicians, and in Charleston, these militias, which are basically shop workers that in the afternoon are drilling, and they're going to amount to maybe 500 men, and these 600 men are going to end up launching the civil, or at least starting the Civil War. Can you speak to how this small group of men end up creating this gigantic war?
Well, remember, Beauregard was in command of an army. I mean, he had several thousand troops. I mean,
well, I guess I'm talking about when Anderson moves from Fort Moultrie to Fort Sumter. That's the situation, and in Pickens, the next morning reacts by seizing Castle Pinckney and Fort Moultrie. And there was sort of an understanding that neither side was going to do anything rash.
Right.
And Buchanan writes Pickens saying, hey, I probably would have ordered Anderson to go back to Fort Moultrie, but you jumped ahead of the game here. So can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, I don't think either side wanted to start a war at Charleston. I think Davis just wanted for it to be evacuated. He wasn't looking to start a war, and Lincoln certainly was not looking to start a war. So both sides were trying to avoid that. Anderson had to move because the troops in Charleston were sort of surrounding, Fort Moultrie from the backside, where it can't be defended. So he either had to surrender or he had to make a move. And he did, and I guess the war could have started. But Buchanan then jumped around and gave assurances that they weren't going to start a war or do anything, that Anderson needed to be in a more secure spot, that they were pressing in on him, and so they were not changing the status quo. So it settled back down again. Because neither side really wanted, Beauregard could have started the war over that, but they just weren't ready to do it. Lincoln hadn't been inaugurated. Buchanan was still president. So I think they figured they had a lot of luck with all these traitors in Buchanan's cabinet. So maybe they thought, we can manipulate this. We got people in Washington. We can get them to surrender. So why start a war? That's what I think.
I would just like that. Don't underestimate musicians, especially if they're in trouble. Pete Boone, John Bonham, Ginger Baker. Tough guys. All Brits do.
Hello? Yeah, I have one.
Sure.
It's not really a question. I'm still reading the book, actually, and I like it, but it's very difficult. The part that almost upsets me as I read it is the descriptions of what happened to slaves. There was one page that I read where an infant was sold, 2-year-old baby was taken from its mother and sold somewhere else. I think it's really hard. But as I was sitting here looking, it's a very interesting discussion. I kind of flashed back maybe 40 years, and I think if there was a discussion going on about roots in this room would be probably packed with African American people who come, because it's a different kind of story. It talks about slavery and everything, but there's resistance and there's heroism and there's no black people here that I can see, but I think that's almost a lingering residue of the pain that was inflicted on African Americans so many years ago. And it's amazing that it's still here. Now I know this is a private club, but interestingly, private clubs don't have that many black folks in them. Anyway, I don't know if there's a comment or I'm eliciting.
Well, that's what the New York Times wrote a very critical review of this book. I think the headline was, maybe Erik Larson should not have written this book, or something. He said he wasn't going to write a book about the Civil War. He said, well, he shouldn't have written this book. And the criticism was there were no black characters in the book. And, well, the problem is his books are based on newspaper accounts, letters, diaries. So you had to have somebody who was involved in it. And the material is not there. I'm not aware of any diaries or material of what the slaves or the free, there were 3,000 free people of color in Charleston in 1860, which is a lot of people. And some of them owned slaves, by the way. And they left diaries, there's material, but I don't think he found the material. If there was a diary or a book or something, about a free black person or an enslaved person, I think he would have included it. But, you know, what he's doing is he's taking actual people, not inventing things. And I don't think there's no material for him to rely on. So I don't think it's.
I think you're right that there's probably no materials that it's ironic because the problem was they couldn't write.
Yeah. Well, free people of color.
Not the slaves.
The slaves. Yeah.
A slave style would be really probably pretty fascinating.
Well, one of the first things they did, you know, after John Brown was they tried to run as many free people out of the city as they could, which goes to show why it was racial, not just slavery, because they were free, they're not slaves. But the white people were just as afraid of them. So, I mean,
I don't want to give anybody a term paper to write, but when I was in college, I actually did write a term paper, and it was to compare and contrast two, you know, periodicals, and I chose the Charleston Gazette and the Boston Abolitionist during this time to compare and contrast. And, you know, for an 18-year-old, it was so interesting to read the same story just from like two different prisms writing about it. So if you do want to go do research, maybe you can find the microfiche that I once read. It's in every university in the Pagoda building.
can you donate a copy of this document to the Library Society so people can check it out?
It's available at, you know, I think it was Candler Library or Woodruff Library.
So I believe we have time for one more right here.
You are first and foremost.
Oh, yeah, right. I maybe have to, with all these comments, draw your attention to Master, Slave, Husband, Wife, which I have just read, and that is a diary, information from a diary written about before the Civil War. It was in the 50s, 1850s, about a slave couple who left the South and went north. So I think that material is there. I'm just not sure that's the story he was telling. The story he was telling was, could we have avoided this war? And here are the parties that were involved and screwed it up.
Yeah.
So I think that makes a difference. And toward the end of his book, he says, here lay the greatest of ironies. In 34 hours of some of the fiercest bombardment the world had ever seen, no one was killed or even seriously injured. Yet the bloodless attack would trigger a war that killed more Americans than any other conflict in the country's history. I think he was just talking about Fort Sumter. And could that have been avoided, and could the war thus have been avoided? So I think that's why some of the African American or the slave characters are not in it, because I think that material is out there.
Which book is it?
Master, Slave, Husband, Wife.
Okay.
It is a magnificent read, and that writer's going to be here next week. The Literary Festival, and she is also going to be at a church event at St. Mark's Episcopal Church. Anyway, there you go.
Is that it? On
That's it.
behalf of the Charleston, I mean, unless you're going to kick us out, and then
We got one more?
We will. We got the cane.
Point me out.
Thank you very much for the conversation. I'm wondering, please, if you can comment on, Lincoln made it very clear that he would leave the decision of slavery up to the states, yet the Southerners were adamant that they wanted to secede. So could you comment about that, having just left that?
Yeah, you're talking about the fact that Lincoln said he wouldn't interfere.
Correct, yes.
Yeah, you know, if everybody was rational, I think Lincoln was sort of amazed that didn't work. You know, Lincoln was a genius and a remarkable human being. And he worked in the 1850s to come up with his position on this, which is not that simple. In other words, he took the framers in the Declaration and put that at the center, not the Constitution. And he talked about, this was an ideal that we had to strive for. And that we had to have a country where we believed that slavery was on the road to ultimate extinction, but he wouldn't touch it where it existed. And I think he really thought he could convince the South that he was sincere about that. And that first inaugural, and he talks about that. He's pleading with the South. I have not attacked your institution. I have not done anything. So the question is, why did the South not accept it? Well, they were all wound up about a series of events. It's kind of like, it was a declaration, it's like a long train of events. In other words, you can't just say, I'm Abraham Lincoln, who they don't know anything about, have no reason to trust, in 1860, and ignore John Brown. I mean, John Brown is like everywhere in the Southerners' mind, and you can't underestimate that. And Seward, who was going to be a big deal in the Lincoln administration, had already said that there was an irrepressible conflict between freedom and slavery, irrepressible. So Seward is already on record in a very famous speech saying that this is going to come to blows. So it was not an irrational reaction. It seems irrational today because they lost. But they felt that it was inevitable that Congress was going to put a limit on slavery, and then when they got the power, they were going to abolish it. And so they were going to strike while the iron is hot. And also they were concerned about the Republican Party. The Republican Party would come in and place people in different positions of power, like you said, in the forts and the postmasters, and have all the patronage, and they would be in a weaker position as the years went by. So it was a bad call.
Got to go, Gabe?
So, with that, I will say thank you, Robert Rosen. Thank you, Mike. Thank you all.
That was awesome.
I had fun.